very fortunate that our newest member, Karen Tibbals, who holds an MBA from Rutgers Business in Marketing School and a master's in Quaker Studies, is going to present her take on the history of Quakers in business, and it's called Just Death. So please welcome, without further ado, Karen Tibbals.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned in my thesis. I am going to need to sit, so I hope everybody can crane their neck and see. So as I was introduced, I have a MA in Quaker history, and my thesis for my strict degree was on how Quakers applied their faith to their business life. Now, there have been several books written which really were extolling how well Quaker businesses did and how honest they were. But I wasn't satisfied with that. I wanted to do something different. So I looked at the beliefs underneath what they were doing, as well as the economic history of the day. And I'm going to share with you some of the things that I learned, which are not common knowledge. As time has gone on, it's been about 10 years since I did the research, I continued to think about what I discovered and the impact that this sect, because Quakers really were a cult back then, they were outside of society, what impact they had on the broader society and on how we live today. And that's what I want to share with you. And I continue to think about it, and I have some new thoughts as I was developing this talk. And I only had a week to do the talk, so please bear with me. Quakerism was born at the same time as capitalism was. And it was influenced by that, and also may have had an impact on how capitalism developed itself. First, I want to ask you to try to get into the time that Quakers lived in. It's very tempting to judge people by the standards of what we know today and how we act today. Instead, I want you to immerse yourself into their world and how they tried to solve their problems. To start out with, let me set the stage. When I say that capitalism was developing at the same time as Quakers, I want to underscore how different life was than the way we live today and how it has changed. We can't understand what went on until we can visualize their lives. The first picture I want to paint is I want you to imagine a world in which society is primarily feudal and agrarian. Most of us are agricultural workers. We work on the farm. We live in a cottage that we don't own. It's owned by the local lord. We would pay rent, which wasn't really rent, from our labor. And in return, we would get to farm the land. We would have a garden outside our door. And we would have a little flock of animals, maybe one or two chickens, maybe a sheep, maybe a cow if we were particularly rich. And we would graze that cattle or whatever on land that was held in common. And this was in a village where anybody could graze their animals on this common land. And that's how we get meat. So that's how we get our food. And there's very little money. There's very little money at all in this world. Now, we owe our allegiance to the local landowner. He, and let me emphasize, it was always a he. It was always a he. He decide what happens in our little corner. If we have a mean landlord, that's what life is like. If we have a generous one, life is very different. This is an autocracy. We have very little control over our lives. Now, a lot of people romanticize this type of life, but it was not particularly pleasant. There was one description that I love, which pretty accurately describes it as nasty, brutish, and short. Thomas Malthus, who is an 18th century theologian, is noted for his description of what happens over time in this kind of environment. And you've heard of Malthusian. This is Thomas Malthus. When the harvest was good, the animals get fattened up, people did well, and they have children. But later, and this could be years later, it could be decades later, the weather would turn bad. And people would the weather always turned bad. And there would be a famine. People would die. So there's a feast and famine cycle that goes on and it repeats itself. And in addition, there's diseases such as smallpox and Black Plague. Now, the Black Plague, I don't know if you guys know this, but it killed 1/3 to 1/2 of the total population in Europe right at the beginning of Quakerism. Subsistence living like this is painful. It involves death, and most children didn't make it to adulthood. At about this time, there's changes in the farming techniques and in the laws of the land, and both of these contribute to making rural life less practical. The new methods of farming meant that they had needed fewer workers. And then there's a series of laws called the enclosure laws that also caused problems. Those animals that we used to graze on the common land, we can't do that anymore. It's been enclosed and it belongs to the local landowner. So now we don't have enough food because we don't have any meat and we don't have any eggs. And we can't do anything about it because this is an autocracy. So there's all at the same time, there's a temptation to move to the city because there's starting to be a lot of activity in the city and opportunities. So what's it like in the city? It's very different than the countryside. Instead of an economy where everything is provided and you don't need any money, you now need to find money somehow for rent and food, and if you can afford it, clothing. But rent and food are the important things. You've never had to pay attention to money like this before. Wages aren't very high. And if you're an unskilled worker, which most of us are, you're not going to be able to earn enough to support a family. Instead, everybody in the family is going to still need to work. It's a totally different way of life. Plus, even in the cities, there isn't a large supply of coin. You can't pay your bills right away. You go out to work and you don't get paid right away. You don't get paid until that person has money. So not only do you have to pay for a bunch of stuff that you didn't have to worry about before, you have to do it without being able to pay as you go. So you have to keep track of what you owe and what you are owed. Very different world, very different world. Now let's turn to religion. And this is at the intersection of religion and economics. So I'm going to be switching back and forth. At this time, very few people are able to read. The cost of a candle that would allow you to read after the sun went down was prohibitively expensive. It would cost you days worth of labor. And plus you don't have money. So where are you going to afford the candle? There's no use in learning how to read because the printing press has just been invented. There's very few books and there's very few printed Bibles. And actually Bibles had been outlawed until this 1611. You learn about religion from your church, from the priest, and from the stained glass windows. Now, at this time, the Church of England has been brought out of the Roman Catholic Church by King Henry VIII, as we all know the story of King Henry VIII. Your religion is always what you're told it is. You have no choice. This is an autocracy, remember, until things start to change. So there's a couple factors behind that change. One is the change in monarchs after Henry VIII died. So those of you who know your English history, King Henry VIII's only son, Edward, did not live very long. He was a teenager when he inherited the throne. He lived like 3 or 4 years. Then afterwards, there was Lady Jane Grey, who ruled for a couple days. Then finally, his daughter, Mary. Now, Mary's mom was Catherine of Aragon. So she brought the Church of England back to the Catholic Church. She married King Philip from Spain, and England became a Catholic country again until she died. And Elizabeth inherited, who brought the church back to being Protestant. Elizabeth reigned for a long period of time, and the next person who inherited the throne was James, who was from Scotland. And he's the one who printed the King James Bible. And by the way, he was gay, for those of you who don't know. And then finally, his son, Charles I, had a tendency towards Roman Catholicism. So there's this back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism with the English monarchs, and you don't get a choice. That's what your religion is. At the same time, Martin Luther and John Calvin are operating in continental Europe. So in Germany, Luther in 1550, Calvin is a little later. And when Mary turns the church back into Catholicism, the Protestant leaning people go to continental England. And then when Elizabeth comes, they come back. And so there's this influence back and forth with the Reformation. And of course, the King James Bible, which is published in 1611, which finally makes God's words available. And now maybe you're just going to start to learn to read because there's something to read. The English Civil Wars come out of all of this turmoil that I've just been describing. And many early Quakers fought on the Puritan side. The Puritan belief was that if the church was purified, it would bring about the second coming of Christ. Who knew that? Who knew that that was what Puritans believed? I was shocked when I learned that. And the Puritans do win the Civil War. Cromwell takes the throne, except he doesn't call it the throne. He calls it the protectorate. He refuses to be crowned king. But despite this, Christ doesn't return. And of course, civil wars always make life worse. They never make life better. So this back and forth, and the fact that the second coming of Christ didn't happen, it led to a movement of seekers and a quest for answers. If the Puritans weren't right, what could happen? What was wrong? What could they believe? And this is where individualism starts to come, where people start thinking for themselves. And Quakerism arises out of this whole factor. But we all know transitions are never smooth. And Quakers were persecuted. And I'm sure you've all heard about the persecution of Quakers. And I'm not going to go into that. There's a lot that could be talked about there, but that's not my topic for today. But I want you to understand that underneath everything I'm saying, there's persecution underneath it. So part of the questioning of religious beliefs that seekers are engaged in is about the specific Puritan belief of predestination. Predestination says that the chosen are going to heaven no matter what they do on earth, that they couldn't earn their way into heaven. And so Puritans have no incentive to act on their beliefs. This behavior provided a major target for early Quaker pamphlet writers. George Fox called people like them professors, which doesn't mean that they taught in a college. It means that they professed their faith, but they didn't act on it. Fox would go into a diatribe using words like lie and cheat, deceit, unrighteousness, hard-heartedness, wronging, cozening, cheating, telling a falsehood, a flattery, defrauding, or unjust dealing. Now, Fox isn't the only one talking like this. There's a lot of other people doing the same thing. I might say that hypocrisy would be a sin among early Quakers if we had a sin. The emphasis on avoiding hypocrisy has led to what today we call the testimony of integrity. Now, as Quakers are moving from the city from the countryside into the city, they need to find a new trade. They need to find a way to make a living. And they need to find a way to do it in such a way to carry out what the Quaker leaders are talking about, so they are honest. So they might become an unskilled labor. If they had a trade, they would use that, or they become a merchants. And a lot of Quakers became merchants. What ended up happening is that a lot of Quaker pamphlets spoke about business related to merchants. And there were three core business practices that arose out of what Quakers said. One way that I'll talk about first is to institute what's called fixed pricing. So it was common in the day where you would go into a shop and you would negotiate to get the best price. The way we would do now for cars, we did that for everything. So if you were a good negotiator, you got a good price. If you weren't a good negotiator, you didn't. And this is an application of the business Bible verse that's quoted by Fox and others. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. So Quakers mostly use this as a prohibition against taking oaths, which could get them into trouble. And I'll talk about that in a minute. but it also meant the Quakers wouldn't engage in the standard practice of bargaining with customers. When they first instituted this practice, they were fearful of losing trade, and indeed they did. One account said they couldn't buy bread for their family because they lost so much money. But gradually they became known for providing a fair price. Now, there's a funny story in one of the Quaker books that talks about what happened when a visitor from France came to London and wanted to buy something. And the first store he went into was a Quaker store. And he was offered a price by the Quaker merchant. And the Frenchman tries to negotiate the price, and the Quaker won't do it. And he gets angry and he leaves and he says, "I'll be damned if I'll buy this from you." So he goes to another store and he bargains, and he gets not as good a price. And he goes to another one, doesn't get as good a price. And he finally goes back to the Quaker merchant, and the Quaker merchant won't sell it to him because he doesn't want to damn his soul. That's fixed price. Another relatively simple practice, but also one that was cheating the customer, was to use dishonest weights and measures. A common practice was to shave the weights. If you think about a balance scale, you use weight, like a 1 pound weight or a ½ pound weight to measure out what's on the other side, and you'd even out the scale. But a common practice is to shave the weights. So you take off a little bit, so you get less than a pound, maybe only 7/8 of a pound when you think you're ordering a pound of meat. They were cheating the customer of what they paid for when they did this, and this was common practice. Today we have rules against it, but back then they didn't. We're talking about early capitalism here. And Britain Yearly Meeting has in its Faith and Practice a sermon that was given by a butcher by the name of Luke Cock. He's from York, England. And in it, he describes the spiritual awakening he had and the struggle that ensued before he finally, what he calls, told the truth. And what he's talking about is exactly what I've been talking about, the weights and measures. And let me read you some of what he says in his sermon. "I remember when I first met with my guide, he led me to a very large and cross place where I was to speak the truth from my heart. And before I used to swear and lie too for gain. 'Nay, then,' I said to my guide, 'I mun leave thee. If thou leads me up that lane, I can never follow. Eyes be ruined of the butchering trade if I must not lie for gain.' Here I left my guide and was filled with sorrow." So this was hard. But then he continues later. "So I found my guide again and began to follow him up this lane and to tell the truth from my heart. I'd been naught but beggary and poverty before, and now I began to thrive at my trade and got to the end of this lane, though with some difficulty." This was hard to do. I'm going to transition now to talk about just debt. And in just debt is much harder to implement than either one of these things that I've just talked about. It was much harder to ensure that if a businessman borrowed money, that they would pay it back as they promised. And you do need to borrow money to start a business. You need to buy the tools of your trade, you need to buy the shop fittings, you need to buy inventory, and you might buy stock from a wholesaler. Paying back what you owed, what you promised to pay back, remember, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, is another application of that verse. But business is an inherently risky enterprise. You can start a business, but you're never sure what's going to happen. And even today, I think it's 80% of all businesses fail within the first 5 years. Plus, you're providing credit to your customers. I just talked about the world in which you don't have the there's no cash, right? So if they don't pay their bills, then you're not going to be able to pay your bills. And one estimate of the day was, this is from a Quaker businessman, that about 20% of his customers didn't pay their bills. 20%. Keep in mind, at the time, there's very few rules about borrowing money at this early stages of capitalism. There's no banks. There's no accounting rules. There's no bankruptcy processes. There's only 2 rules that I was able to uncover. First is usury. You've probably heard the term. Let me explain a little bit about it. It was a legacy of the Roman Catholic prohibition against any interest at all. You could not charge interest according to the Roman Catholic Church beginning in about 1150. Now, John Calvin, one of the Protestant reformers, modified this to allow people to charge 6% interest. And because of the influence on Calvin on the Puritans, that's what English religious leaders picked up and appear to have agreed that that was appropriate. This is not Quaker, this is Puritan. The other major rule is debtor's prison, which was allowed if a creditor sued you. If you had a debt over £2, you could be sued by your creditor. And if you didn't pay him back after the court case, you would be thrown into debtor's prison. Now, that only happens about 10% of the time. It doesn't happen all the time. Prison was to be avoided at all costs. And when you're in prison, that doesn't eliminate your debt. It's not, you don't get out of paying your debt by going to prison. You stayed in prison until you either paid it back, presumably you had money hidden away somewhere that you weren't going to give to the debtor, or somebody got somebody else to pay it back for you, and then you'd owe that person the money. So this would go on and on and on. While you're in prison, you need to provide your own food. So you had to either have money or friends who are going to get you food, or else you'll starve to death. Literally, you'll starve to death in prison. And Quakers are already running risk of imprisonment for their faith. They don't need another reason for imprisonment. And further, because they won't take an oath, if somebody sues them, they can't respond in court. So they're going to prison if anybody sues them. The easy answer that Quakers could have come up with would have been to disown anybody who didn't pay their debts and clear house of all the people who were cheating. And they did disown people, and I'll talk about that more. And the statistics from Pennsylvania yearly meeting that someone has compiled showed that about half the people who didn't pay back debts were disowned within the Society of Friends. But what happens if it's not your fault? What happens if your customers didn't pay their debts? Should you just run into people who had bad circumstance? How should you handle this? It took a while, but over time, Quakers developed a set of rules about borrowing money that they called just debt. These are codified in the advices and queries of the day, and I used a lot of other Quaker sources to understand them better. Here's what I learned. First, there's no overt definition of what a just debt is. They just use the phrase over and over again. But there's clues. One of the clues is about how creditors, that all creditors should be treated equally in terms of bankruptcy, about the harm that might be caused if the debt wasn't paid back, and how creditors should be paid back even if they just agreed to settle for less. So thus, borrowing money in a just manner probably meant borrowing from creditors who needed the money to be paid back and who should be treated equally. So that wouldn't be a money lender. It probably was within the Society of Friends, because we're talking about a sect that's outside of the whole rest of society. So it makes perfect sense that Quakers wouldn't borrow money from outside the religious group. Another key element of just debt is paying on time. The importance of this directive becomes clear when you look at the perspective of debts being owed to a family member or a close connection, or even another Quaker wholesaler. So there's probably an intricate web of debt within the Society of Friends. If one person doesn't pay their debts, that would result in their creditors not being able to pay theirs, and their creditors not being able to pay theirs, and so on and so on and so on. Given the interlocking relationships in the Society of Friends, this would have had terrible consequences for a lot of people and would reflect badly on the entire body of Quakers. We see this in the 1732 advice from London Yearly Meeting that an unpaid debt would bring considerable loss among others. It's also seen in a 1710 advice in Philadelphia Yearly Meeting about injury of their just creditors. In addition to consequences of making a number of people unable to pay the money they owed, There could be other consequences if some of the friends in this interlocking web of debt owed money outside the society of friends. As I mentioned, if you needed to go to court, you're going to lose if you're a Quaker, and you're going to go to prison. Another aspect of just debt concerned how the money was intended to be used. Fox and others railed against extravagance, and there's many advices against luxury. Debt for consumption, especially extravagant consumption purposes, would not be a just debt. But an attempt to better oneself by taking on debt to start in a trade would probably qualify as a just debt. And we might consider that to be today's testimony of simplicity as a legacy of that. Finally, I'll talk about a rule about not taking on debt to invest in risky or hazardous enterprises. I'm going to talk about that more in a couple minutes, but I want you to remember that we're talking about a time when ships are traveling all over the world to explore and trade, and it's tempting to invest in the enterprise with the belief that you're going to make the money back several times. But that's also risky because ships can be lost at sea. They're lost at sea all the time. So investing in them with borrowed money wouldn't be a just debt because it was a quote unquote hazardous enterprise. Now, what I've been talking about is from a wide range of dates. It took a while to build up these rules about just debt, probably about 150 years overall. It wasn't clear what would work to solve the problem. These are big problems. These aren't obvious problems, but they kept at it and they kept making revisions. And unlike what happened with the usury laws in the Catholic Church, these rules are made by the lay people. These rules are made by the very people who are being affected by the rules. In the usury rules, the authorities laid down the law, and then when they made a change, it was 300 years later. Quakers were slower to act, but they were quicker to revise because they were the real people involved in it. Despite this success in rulemaking, people didn't always follow the rules. Minutes of local meetings record that debtors didn't follow the procedures and they absconded to London or they went to the New World. So I'm going to give you two examples of Quakers who had problems with their debt, and I'm going to explain to you what happened to them. The first one is William Penn, who I'm sure you all know about. He spent most of his life in England, not much time in Pennsylvania. He wrote about debt. He went to debtor's prison, but he was never disowned. The most interesting thing that I found that Penn wrote was in his advice to children, where he exhorted them to be diligent and frugal and used a version of a phrase that we tend to associate with Ben Franklin: a penny saved is a penny got. And he expands on it, going on to say, for many got that cannot keep, and for want of frugality spend what they get, and so come to want what they have spent. Despite these fine-sounding statements, Penn had financial trouble during his life, and there were a number of factors that contributed. There was his extravagant living style, one that he was brought up in. He grew up very wealthy, but was contrary to Quaker practices and was contrary to that advice I just told you he said to his children. He had inherited Irish estates and they became worthless. They weren't producing income anymore. And then he invested a lot of money to open up Pennsylvania, and he never got anything back. The only thing he got back from Pennsylvania was a shipload of produce. That was it. People in the New World didn't have money to pay rent. All they had was produce. And then he had this tendency not to review documents before signing them. And Penn did not deal well with the debt he incurred. He had a guy that he worked with that he borrowed a lot of money from. And when the guy died, his widow sued him for the money, which was 20,000 pounds. Now, this is like 1700. Think about how much 20,000 pounds would be worth back then. A few million, probably. Of course, when she sued him and he went to court, he wouldn't take an oath. So he lost. He lost the court case. So when the judgment was entered against him, he refused to pay on the grounds that his creditor had falsified his books, and he went into debtor's prison instead. The Quaker community rallies around and offers to pay the debt for him, and Penn refuses, and he doesn't owe it. Now, this is really high profile. This is big stakes. So the Lord Chancellor, Duke of Marlborough, intervenes and he negotiates a settlement, and Penn acquiesces to the settlement. In 1708, he's released after 7 months in prison. Quakers didn't always do what they said they were going to do. The second example I'm going to give you is a banker by the name of Joseph Fry. I said at the beginning of this period, there's no banks. But Quakers did become some of the earliest bankers because they were trusted. Of course, there's no modern day business practices that we're used to, and nor is there a government guarantee for deposits in the bank the way we have here in the US. Two names you may know of banks that still exist are Barclays or Lloyd's, which were founded by Quakers. Two names you probably don't know are Fry and Gurney, both Quaker banks, which were in the 19th century. Gurney is the larger bank. And indeed, the Gurneys were called by the government to help stabilize the economy in several economic crises. The Fry Bank is smaller, was run by Joseph Fry, who was a husband of Elizabeth Fry, who you may have heard of as the noted prison reformer. The other thing to know about Elizabeth Fry is she's the sister of one of the Gurneys. Joseph was both a tea dealer and a banker and was not as successful as his wife's family, the Gurneys. After several crises in which his wife's family bails Joseph out, Elizabeth's brother decides not to do it again. So both the bank and the tea business finally go bankrupt in the late 1820s. His depositors lose their money, and Joseph is disowned. The disownment minute also states that I'm going to quote here, impudent manner of conducting business has brought great and lamentable loss to a large body of creditors and reproach upon our Christian profession. Joseph Fry is probably partially disowned because of the prominence of his wife, but also maybe his attitude. But as I've been trying to get across to you, it was easy to fall into difficulties. Now, Joseph probably wasn't very good. He probably wasn't a very good banker, or else he wouldn't have been bailed out so many times. But maybe he shouldn't have been a banker. But should he have been disowned? I'm not sure about that. But I also want to use this as an example to talk about what happens when you go into bankruptcy. When a creditor sues you, the creditor could take everything you owned, everything, except the clothes on your back, literally except the clothes on your back. And so the Fry family, the children, had to go live with their in-laws, the Gurneys. When there was trouble, and I've talked about some individuals here, I'm going to talk about some systemic troubles more next. Quakers revised the rules to address the problem when they find a systemic problem. The clearest example I found of revisions following trouble is what happened when the South Sea bubble popped. You may have heard of the South Sea bubble. It came about as a result of the run of the stock of the South Sea Company. This company was chartered in 1712 in order to refinance the debt of the British monarchy at more favorable rates. In return, Queen Anne gave the company the rights to explore in South America, and that's where the name South Sea Company comes from. The opportunity to make money from the New World was very exciting to people, and that drove up the price of the stock. But what wasn't realized was that those rights were worth very little in reality because the South America is dominated by Spain and Portugal. When people realized that, it resulted in a sharp decline in the value of the stock in 1720, and the bubble pops. Unfortunately, despite being risky, Quakers had invested in it. And 4 years after the bubble popped in 1724, the bubble pops in 1720, so 4 years later, in 1724, Quakers developed an advice, and I'm going to quote, "It is earnestly desired that friends be very careful to avoid all pursuit after the things of this world by such ways and means to depend too much on hazardous enterprises." You can hear the South Sea bubble in the term hazardous enterprises, can't you? But this episode isn't over. A group of Quakers had misappropriated corporate funds from the London Lead Company, a Quaker-run company, and they invested that money in the South Sea Company. And then, of course, they lost everything when the bubble burst in 1720. But they don't own up to it. They hide the fact that they lost the money. It was hidden for several years because it went against all these advices I've just been talking about. And when it was discovered in 1728, there was this huge scandal. So the scandal and the conspiracy appear to have prompted London Yearly Meeting to develop a new advice 4 years later. There's a trend here. It's always 4 years later. And in the new advice, they ask monthly meetings to watch over their individual members, presumably because the advices to individual members wasn't enough, or else this stuff wouldn't have happened. The Quaker answer was to create a structure to ensure that the rules were followed. This added an element that was intended to help members develop discipline. At first, members were to check in with other members if they saw them getting into trouble, paying back their debts, or keeping to their contracts. But after that, 4 years later, more intrusive advices followed, asking meetings to inspect the accounts of members once a year, even if they're not in trouble. This is first auditors. If member did get into trouble, the members of the meeting were to inspect the accounts and work with the creditors. The attitude of the member and the cause of the difficulties were crucial. If the cause wasn't fraud and the member was repentant, then the meeting would work with the member. But if the member showed any signs of untoward dealings or refused the meeting's involvement, he would be disowned. So the principles behind just debt were keep good accounts, so you know how much money you have and what you owe. Don't take on more than you can handle, both in terms of business and debt. And they called this over trading. If you ever run into the phrase over trading, that's what they're talking about. Keep your word in contracts. Pay back your debts on time if you can. Don't do anything too risky. Only borrow for a worthwhile purpose. Borrow from a reputable source. And if you do get into trouble, if you can't pay back your debt, you pay back your creditors to the extent that you can, equally. This is the only religious group that I've been able to find who has such a detailed list of practices for how to operate ethically and specifically how to borrow money ethically. Of course, this didn't mean Quaker business people didn't get into trouble. They did repeatedly, as I've just illustrated. But they had this set of rules as their guidepost, which was clear. And it was based on biblical principles. They didn't pull this out of the air. It was based on let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, which is from Matthew. And do the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it worked. Quaker business people were regarded as upright and honest. And the purpose of these was not to help them make money. I want to emphasize that. They aren't trying to help them become successful, but it did. It did help them become prosperous. And the question that has come up for me as I've been thinking about this past decade was whether or not these procedures that the Quakers developed bled into the broader society and because they set an example of how to run a bank, how they did accounting practices, how they had bankruptcy practices, how they had auditing practices, all these things that we have today that Quakers developed back then as part of their just debt practices. So let's turn to what I've come to believe is the impact of the development on capitalism. You probably heard the term Protestant work ethic. This derives from a translation of a phrase coined by Max Weber, a German sociologist who wrote a book in the early 20th century called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber attempted to answer the question of why capitalism arose in England by looking at what he thought were the religious writings of the Puritans. The answer he came up with was the Protestant work ethic. Now, he did acknowledge other factors. That wasn't the only thing he said. And the trade with the New World was one of the answers. But he did focus on the elements of the spirit of capitalism, such as believing that the work you did was part of your calling. His conclusions have been challenged multiple times by religious scholars, by economic scholars, and other factors have been identified, and there's been fallacies that have been identified. So he's not the be all and end all. But when I read Weber, what I discovered myself was that his Puritans also included the Quakers. He read Fox, he read Robert Barclay, and he grouped them in with the Puritans. And he used Benjamin Franklin. And when you think about Franklin, and I quoted Frank, I said how similar Franklin was to what Penn said. Franklin was apprenticed to a Quaker printing master in Philadelphia. So he's very involved in a society in which is very Quaker. So he's not necessarily a Puritan. He's perhaps more of a Quaker. And Weber doesn't recognize this. But I'm not the only one who noticed that Weber's talking about Quakers. 20th century Quaker historian Frederick Tolles, who's a contemporary of Weber, validates many of Weber's observations as being true of Quakers. Tolles notes that Quakers generally did express themselves very similar to Puritans, so says Weber's not totally wrong. Like Puritans, Tolles said Quakers abhorred idleness and felt one could have a calling on this earth. He was also identified the differences. He mentions what we would today call the testimony of simplicity and other related virtues that Quakers held, which Tolles believed were relevant to their economic life, was frugality, which is again simplicity, prudence, honesty, and a strong sense of order. So if we buy Weber's argument that the Protestant ethic is crucial to the development of capitalism, not the only factor, but an element that's important, just by being who they were, Quakers did have an influence on the development of capitalism, helping to ensure it developed where and when it did. But I've been talking about just debt. So what Weber missed was just debt in terms of leading the way and teaching members how to handle money and how to borrow. They set an example for society in an era in which there were no rules. Again, perhaps those rules bled into broader society, which is speculation on my part. I can't prove that. But it's amazing how closely the rules mirror what Quakers came up with. But this other insight that I had was how important it was in economics to be able to borrow and lend money and how that leads to increased prosperity. Without that ability, our society would be much poorer. There's a fundamental principle in economics called monetarism. When the money supply increases, it makes everybody better off. And it was identified as one of the major causes of the Great Depression, that the money supply decreased by a third, and that's what caused the Great Depression. And it was that insight which led to the TARP legislation in the Great Recession, and which led to the payments that we had during the pandemic. And the US has recovered much faster than other countries because of those payments. So there's some validation of the fact that the money supply does really matter. An increase in money supply encourages trade, again, which makes everybody richer. And I talked about the limited money supply there was, the limited supply of coins. And that's why monarchs would send out ships to look for gold and silver. They were trying to increase the money supply. But Quakers themselves increased the money supply by lending money. You didn't have to actually had to have coins. You could have the trade and make the money supply increase. And today banks do that by lending money. And we print money. So to the extent that a broader society, if they instituted similar practices as Quakers did to borrow money responsibly, that could have caused an increase in the money supply and led to greater development. And then, of course, there's a cost when you don't pay debt back. I talked about the 20% of people who wouldn't pay their bills. And if you reduce that your business cost decreases. So there's a lot of benefits to paying back money responsibly, to paying just debt. To summarize, Quakerism developed at the same time as capitalism when there's only a couple of pre-existing rules, which were the usury rule and debtor's prison. It's a difficult time to learn how to operate in a society that hasn't existed before, one in which it's easy to be unethical and hypocritical. Now, as an aside, you guys may have heard about the prosperity gospel, where you're promised, where if you donate a lot of money to the church, you'll get it back tenfold. they operate in a very similar environment when things are changing. They grow up in Africa and South America and Asia, and they're trying to help. The reason why they prosper is because their members need help in navigating the difficult system when you're changing from one environment at the economic environment to another economic environment. Quakers were in a similar position in early capitalist England, but they did it in a very ethical way, in a very different way, in a way that I'm very happy to have discovered. To enable Quakers to operate businesses in a manner keeping with their principles and keep their word in all things, Quakers developed a set of rules about debt that they called just debt. Not everybody follows them, so the rules needed to evolve as new problems developed. The rules are still relevant today. Just to summarize the rules, keep good accounts so you know how much money you have and what you owe. Don't take on more than you can handle, both in business and debt. Keep your word in contracts. Pay back your debts on time. Don't do anything too risky. Only borrow for worthwhile purposes. Borrow from a reputable source. If you do get into trouble, you can't pay it back. Pay them back to the extent you can and equally. Do not favor one over the other. Max Weber claimed that Puritan and work ethic was at least somewhat responsible for capitalism first developing in England, but he's at least somewhat talking about Quakers, but he missed the just debt rules that they developed, which were extremely important to helping to increase trade and probably made our society richer, especially given the limited money supply. If the broader society did learn from the Quakers how to borrow money responsibly, they could have increased the money supply and led to greater prosperity. This might have been part of what enabled society to escape the trap of feast and famine that Thomas Malthus described as problems in agrarian economy. I shudder to think what capitalism would have looked like without Quakers to demonstrate how to run a business and borrow money in an ethical manner. This is what I've been thinking about in the 10 years since I finished the research for my thesis. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. Thanks.